Hello, my name is Sarah Garnich, and in this presentation, I'm going to discuss the ongoing environmental and health problems occurring in the aptly named area known as Chemical Valley. This presentation will demonstrate the enduring effects of colonialism with respect to historical and legal issues and the necessity to begin the reconciliation process. Situated in Sarnia, Ontario, Chemical Valley is home to 63 petrochemical facilities, encircling the Aamjiwnaang First Nation residents. The health impacts are glaring and have included miscarriages, asthma, high rates of cancer, polychlorinated biphenyl or PCBs, and mercury found in hair and blood samples, and the disproportionate births of females compared to males, known as an endocrine disruption, which has garnered considerable attention. The negative environmental conditions have caused Chemical Valley to be dubbed by the World Health Organization as one of the top Canadian hotspots for air pollution, and as the picture on the slide suggests, it is a very menacing sight. The environmental minister's decision to permit Suncor to increase its petroleum refinement activities has potentially aggravated the already hazardous health and environmental situation, therefore highlighting the ongoing exploitative relationship by the state towards Indigenous peoples. This case is ongoing. On February 8, 2014, a chemical spill by Plains Mainstream Canada had benzene levels measured at 50 parts per billion. Prolonged exposure to high amounts of benzene can cause cancer. Even more recently, on February 23, 2017, flares, as depicted on the bottom picture of the slide, occurred to what Imperial Oil alleges was an equipment malfunction. The ministry noted that the flaring was of volatile organic compounds, namely the carcinogen benzene and sulfur. The World Health Organization has noted when speaking of benzene that, quote, no safe level of exposure can be recommended. These perceivable challenges for residents are alarming and demand action. Land is culturally significant to the Aamjiwnaang First Nation. Aamjiwnaang translates to at the spawning stream. The reserve is currently located along the St. Clair River. The word Aamjiwnaang in Ojibwe indicates an important gathering place, which was located at the base of Lake Huron and was used for millennia. This communal nature cannot be ignored. It is embedded in the very name and history of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation. The Aamjiwnaang First Nation adhere to Anishinaabe law, which maintains that individuals should be stewards of our land and must care for it and respect it. The Aamjiwnaang First Nation also have exclusive treaty rights to use and exercise their harvesting rights on the land. The land has also been used for conducting ceremonies and housing sacred sites. Cultural and historical ties should further indicate the necessity to initiate positive change. You may be wondering how the current location of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation came to be. The size of traditional land was reduced by Sarnia's encroachment, which took place in the years 1850 to 1950. The Aamjiwnaang First Nation territory was dramatically reduced from more than 10,000 to 3,100 acres. The 1892 Sarnia Indian Reserve map, present on this slide, demonstrates that the planning and resizing of traditional land has had a long history. The Indian Act of 1876 entitled the Canadian government to fiduciary power to sell and surrender Aamjiwnaang First Nation territory. Fiduciary is defined as the relationship that a trustee would have with their beneficiary, indicating that there is a degree of trust between these parties. However, due to the Aamjiwnaang First Nation's reduced population and territory size, land became vacant and available for activities such as petrochemical manufacturing. Arguably, this legacy of exploitation is sustained by limiting the Aamjiwnaang First Nation's inherent right to territorial land. Further progress is required for a more equitable relationship. Sovereignty is a key concept to highlight. It is easily forgotten that Indigenous peoples have a preceding occupational history in the land now known as Canada. In 1995, Aboriginal peoples' right to self-government was recognized in the Inherent Right policy. However, the right to protect traditional land has not been fully enjoyed by the Aamjiwnaang First Nation residents. Chemical Valley showcases the recurring effect of the Indian Act, where the Aamjiwnaang First Nation transitioned from being allies of the French and later the British to becoming what has been termed wards of the state. This means that there is a right to physically occupy the land, but there is little agency granted to the occupants. The status as wards of the state has been perpetuated through the federal and provincial government's control, which has had devastating health and environmental effects by failing to conduct a health survey. This is alarming considering that Sarnia is 25 kilometers away from the plants. The close vicinity and the relegation to unsafe and minimal land demonstrates the ongoing history of colonization, which should be mentioned and recognized if steps are to be made towards reconciliation. The legality of these issues have not gone unchallenged. In 2012, Ada Lockridge and Ron Plain, both members of the Amjinung First Nation, brought forth a legal claim against the Ministry of the Environment, precipitated by its decision to allow Suncor to increase its petroleum refinement activities, as mentioned earlier. Unable to stand idly by, the litigants claimed that the right to procedural fairness was infringed, as well as their rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically Section 7 affirming life, liberty, and security of person, and Section 15.1 affirming equality rights. These rights should be upheld in order to promote fairness and ensure the safety of residents. Furthermore, since a cumulative assessment of the industry's impact was not administered by the federal government, they have therefore not taken their full responsibility under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 to ensure that Aboriginal rights are acknowledged and upheld. Additionally, the negative health and environmental effects of the petrochemical facility's operations are in contravention of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act 1999, which affirms that the federal government bears the responsibility to use regulatory and also non-regulatory measures to, quote, protect the environment and human health. Upholding this constitutional act has been considerably lacking. The environmental minister breached the court's mandate by failing to conduct a cumulative review, potentially causing further harm to the environment and health of residents. This is a legal obligation under the Environmental Bill of Rights. It has been argued as to whether there is a lack of government oversight in its response to emissions and industry leaks. This has been demonstrated through a lack of field response, failure to lay charges, and delayed reporting. One could also argue, as Lockridge does, that the right to a healthy environment is a human right, one which has been greatly diminished by the industry's activities and the lack of adequate governmental response. Vanessa Gray, a member of the Amjinung First Nation, and Elaine MacDonald, an eco-justice scientist, filed an application for legal charges against Imperial Oil for violating two Ontario laws, namely emitting contaminants found to have a negative effect and the discomfort and the inability to enjoy one's property. It is important to recognize that local residents are taking actions to ensure that their rights are upheld. This case is not limited to local or even national context. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, an international document, may have been contravened, specifically Article 26.3 stating, quote, states shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources. Such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the Indigenous peoples concerned. The arguably callous disregard for both the health and the environmental conditions is not in accordance with the aforementioned article. The government should recognize this international standard in order to better protect Indigenous peoples. Furthermore, the United Nations Development Group Guidelines on Indigenous Peoples' Issues notes that through negotiation, a nation may address impediments to Aboriginal peoples' quote, right to development, which can be accomplished by ensuring that laws are upheld. Greater attention and action is necessary for local and potentially international change. Colonization has continued into the present. The environmental minister's delay in conducting a cumulative review mimics the behavior of colonists, since predetermined agreements with Aboriginal peoples were not fully respected. Similar to the doctrine of discovery, which was a principle affirming that by virtue of, quote, discovering the Aboriginal land, a European power would acquire sovereignty, therefore leaving Aboriginal peoples with a right of occupancy, to reside but not to rule in the land. Chemical Valley, in a similar fashion, has also not granted residents sufficient agency over their own affairs. The residents of Chemical Valley have an attachment to this land, and such negative conditions may force them to choose between their ancestral land and their health, thus limiting their mobility, similar to the pass system which historically was used to regulate movement on and off reserves. Like the picture on the slide illustrates, residents may feel trapped. Environmental racism has been raised in this case. Similar to the colonists regarding Indigenous peoples as inferior, the treatment of the Amjinung First Nation may be unequal when compared to non-Aboriginal people. The Professional Engineers Government of Ontario has since 2009 brought forward public health concerns which have been ignored by the Environmental Ministry, to the effect of being called muzzling by PEGO. Such silencing continues the colonial effect of minimizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. Although reconciliation is difficult, it is necessary to move away from this colonial legacy. To begin the process of reconciliation, the Canadian government needs to recognize the Amjinung First Nations Chi-Nikawayan Community Constitution, outlining a dedication to a sustainable environment for future generations. Understanding the centrality of land according to Anishinaabe law will also aid in the reconciliation process, as measures can be taken by the state to ensure that land is protected and health is ensured. Through negotiation and adherence to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to actions, outlining guidelines for the government to uphold, may further aid in this reconciliation process and provide for better guidance, and direction for the government's future actions. Overcoming the colonial mentality is necessary for reconciliation and progress towards a more equitable relationship. Although greater attention has been afforded to Chemical Valley, action now must be made in order to combat these negative effects. Thank you for listening to this presentation.